certain instances when we're actually working with the public. The best example I can give is maybe 3 or 4 meetings ago that I was attending. There was a contributing property that was Nation Vernacular. It originally had a concrete tile roof. That roof had been removed. The applicant wanted to do a metal roof. The metal roof had never been on that building before. We had a history of the building file. And staff couldn't recommend the metal roof because it hadn't been there per our guidelines. Part of the justification for approving the metal roof was that the windows had been replaced under a C of A several years prior. That logic might seem okay on the face of it, that since something had already been changed, you can change something else. But under our guidelines, changes that are made under a certificate of appropriateness also are intended to maintain the integrity and character of a building and not jeopardize or change that. So the windows emulated as closely as possible what was there prior in the building file. And so using that as justification to make a jump to something else may have been the wrong avenue. And we probably need to discuss how we get to incorporate new materials and new approaches in Lake Worth, because I think one of the biggest bones of contention is windows and roofs. One of the things that I find more interesting than not is people don't necessarily know the history of the concrete tile roof and why we have so many of them. But there was a trade embargo in the late 20s which actually affected our freight depot that's now the Design Arts Center. It was built as a freight depot, but there was an embargo, and freight was not allowed to come down to Florida. And this is right after the 1926 hurricane, we were before the 1928 one, and then we have the Great Depression. Well, there was an interest in figuring out what can we do with indigenous materials in Florida because metal was not available. It couldn't be had or it was too expensive. John Volk and Howard Major wanted to do white tile roofs like they were in Bermuda. The first white tile roofs were in Palm Beach, and they were terracotta tile because we didn't manufacture here, they were painted white. The first rain came, and then we had pink roofs, which was not the greatest thing. So they got investigating, well, what does Florida have? Well, Florida has concrete and some white clay. And so that was the evolution of the white tile roof. And then after the Depression, we had the World War, which materials were still limited. And then there's a building boom very soon after the war where materials were still sort of scarce. Florida, as you can see, with the proliferation of those roofs, those white concrete tile roofs show and are demonstrated throughout our historic districts based on a significant period of development and investment in Lake Worth. Your biggest building boom happened in the 60s, the late 50s, 60s, and early 70s. Probably a third of the buildings in the city were built during that time, and a very high percentage of them had the concrete tile roofs, which were the prevalent material for roofing in Florida at the time. That's evolved over time too, but now there's a very big interest in metal roofs for a number of reasons. But the character-defining features on many of those mid-century modern buildings is the roof. It's about all it has sometimes, is that roof with its horizontality and its shingle look and it being very thick dimensionally, and its windows. And there's where we need to work together to come to some kind of resolution on how we're going to move forward on representing an appropriate history and interpretation of a significant period of time in Lake Worth, which is, to me, one of the most important aspects of it. After that period, it seemed that we took a 25 or 30-year slow decline, and now we're trying to build the city back up again. And it's a period I think the city should celebrate and embrace, as well as appreciate, because it was a lot of people that I know, their first experiences growing up in Lake Worth in those houses. Their parents came down and built a house in those communities. It also was a time where Lake Worth had its biggest vacation rental population. It was a vacation destination. We had a proliferation of hotels that were built on Federal Highway and Dixie Highway. And I think that sort of speaks to the height of Lake Worth. And then now we're trying to climb back up out of a long period of decline. And that history really shouldn't be forgotten. I don't know if everybody really appreciates where Lake Worth has been and why those buildings are important. The second part of our little presentation before we jump to the board for more discussion, unless you have questions right now, is some information that was presented on why preserve in the first place. Lake Worth did take an active role in adopting a preservation ordinance. It's incorporated through various chapters of our comprehensive plan. Both the federal government and the state government, as Katie mentioned, encourage historic preservation. Lake Worth wasn't the last one to jump on the bandwagon, and as you can tell, there's been a program in the city for almost 20 years. However, there's been some lapses in how well it was managed and how it was run and the understanding of why we had it. But I'll turn it over to Amy, who will go through, this was presented at the Preservation Foundation in Palm Beach. The gentleman here's prepared a paper with the National Trust on why does preservation matter, and that's a question I've been asked a lot by not only you, but also the public, the commission, people that visit the area. And so I think it'd be important that we just look at that too a little bit.
Unfortunate that the people, our neighbors at home can't see the screen.
Could you
Could
hit the light up there? I could catch it.
Carolyn?
The light.
Okay.
Hit the other light?
Yeah,
Well,
They'll have no lights on.
that's okay.
see.
Keep your hands to
Better
home.
to drop the front one and leave the back one on.
Yeah, can you turn the back one on, please?
And we will have links and posts on the city website too.
That's better.
Yes.
So just a brief introduction, I'm Amy Sunny, I'm the city's Senior Preservation Coordinator. A little bit about my background, in case anybody doesn't know. I did do my undergraduate degree in classical architecture from the University of Notre Dame, and I also did my master's degree in historic preservation from Ball State University. I worked for Indiana Landmarks, which is the nation's largest nonprofit organization for historic preservation. I also worked for the city of Chicago in their permit and landmarks review division. And prior to coming to work for the city, I worked for a high-end classical residential architecture firm in Palm Beach, and I have been with the city since August of 2014. All of you probably recognize me at this point. So this is a presentation that I attended, and actually afterwards was able to speak with Tom Mays. So you can see from the slide here, Tom Mays is the Deputy General Counsel for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He's actually a lawyer who primarily focuses on matters regarding easements and real estate transactions. However, he was awarded the 2013 Rome Prize in Historic Preservation and spent 6 months in Rome researching the concept of why old places matter. And this was a really big movement by the National Trust for Historic Preservation a few years ago. There's quite a few links online to talk about this. And his research really spurred a whole series on why do old places matter. On the bottom of the slide here, I've included the blog where you can find all of the articles. What I'm going to go through today is a very, very brief summary of a lot of the ideas that he has in that in the research work that he conducted. But please certainly do look into some of those additional articles. They're incredibly well done and very well written. And Mr. Mays is in great support of us using the presentation tonight, or really it's an adjusted version of his presentation. So one quote that he used is that, "I look forward to an America which will not be afraid of grace and beauty, which will protect the beauty of our natural environment, which will preserve the great old American houses and squares and parks of our national past, and which will build handsome and balanced cities for our future." That was President John F. Kennedy. So in the way that May set up his presentation, he talks about different aspects of preservation. Just to go through all of them briefly, continuity is the first one. The idea of continuity is that in a world that is constantly changing, old places provide people with a sense of being part of a continuum that is necessary for them to be psychologically and emotionally healthy. Also, preservation gives a sense of orientation to our society, using structures and objects of the past to establish values of time and place. Continuity also helps people to feel more balanced, stable, and healthy. And research in environmental aesthetics shows that people generally prefer historic places to modern architecture. Historical sites create a sense of continuity with the past, embody the group traditions, and facilitate place attachment. The next portion is memory. Old buildings are like memories you can touch. Places are key triggers for both individual memories, such as those very personal memories and stories of childhood or growing up and visiting different places that have meaning to you, and collective memory, or the memory shared by the larger society. This can sometimes it is often associated with buildings. It's also associated with events and cultural places. Memory is an essential part of consciousness, and places embody our memories. Individual identity. Our old places, if they continue to exist, serve as reference points for measuring, refreshing, and recalibrating our identity over time. They are literally the landmarks of our identity. It's important to note that in individual identity, each community might have its own individual identity. In addition, each specific building has its own individual identity. Katie used this photo before and talked about its unique individual characteristics, and that's the same for every single structure in our historic districts that we look at. Every structure was built with a different level of detail, a different level of craftsmanship, different materials, and different influences that really went into the founding of that structure. Civic identity is the continued presence of old places that permits the acknowledgement of history and former identities and the transformation of identity over time. The necessary and continuous critical revision of identity informed by the past. Civic identity is often changing and is also tied into culture, events that have happened throughout time, different cultural shifts and things like that. One example we used here was the post office, which was done during the WPA era, and really brings to mind a lot of what the cultural shifts were that were happening in that time period. Beauty. The history of preservation demonstrates a remarkable march of the ugly transforming into the beautiful. Victorian, and I will say this is a direct quote from his article, but I thought it was very, very interesting based on a lot of our debates that we've had. Victorian buildings were condemned as the worst expressions of a degraded era. Art Deco was considered commercial and hideous. Industrial buildings were treated as having no architectural value. Mid-century modern was dated. All of these were once considered ugly and are now generally considered, or starting to be considered, beautiful. It's always easier to say places that people consider beautiful than a place, no matter how historically significant, that people think is ugly. I think this is a really telling quote that historic preservation embodies so much more than just the beautiful or the cute or what is sort of the social trend at the time. Historic preservation is really about beauty in all of its forms. History. The National Park Service website says that historic places have powerful and provocative stories to tell. As witnesses to the past, they recall the events that shaped history and the people who faced those situations and issues. Here on the screen you see part of Lake Worth's history. So we have a photo at the top of what is now the City Hall Annex building, which was a school, and that was prior to it being destroyed in the hurricane. And then on the bottom picture you see what it is today, which you can tell it was substantially altered and rebuilt as a result of the fact that from the hurricane, the entire roof was taken off and large portions of the second floor were destroyed. Architecture. So this is architecture with a big A, which embodies the concepts of proportion, balance, and harmony, as well as the marks of craftsmanship. Old buildings help us understand deeper layers of our existence, from the sometimes thrilling experience of an architectural icon, to the mark of the people who made the place, to the symbolic and historic meanings that places reveal. I'll also say in his article he talks about that many people innately understand architecture as that aha moment when you walk into a beautiful place and you just really recognize and understand and appreciate that there was so much that went into the making of that building. It talks about, it really has to do with the craftsmanship and the detail and the understanding of all different, the style of architecture and the design features that were employed in that. Sacred. Regardless of the source of the perception of sacredness, these places are also valued by those both inside and outside of the specific faith because of history, architecture, art, memory, identity, and beauty, and broader senses of the sacred. Creativity. One of the key ingredients of creativity is authenticity, as seen in real buildings, real people, and real history. A place that's full of chain stores, chain restaurants, and chain nightclubs is seen as inauthentic. Not only do those venues look pretty much the same everywhere, but they offer the same experience you could have anywhere. That quote is by Richard Florida. And especially in Lake Worth, the impact of historic preservation on creativity is something that just cannot be ignored here. Historic preservation and historic places, there have been a lot of studies done recently that talk about how historic areas foster creativity and that people feel more connected with their past, they feel more encouraged to write, to do artwork, and to really employ all of sort of creativity and arts. And I think you can definitely see that here in our community with all the different initiatives that we have for the arts. The Street Painting Festival is up there, So I think it's a really important thing to remember about creativity. Also important in this quote is talking about sort of that sense of place, that Lake Worth doesn't look like any other community, and it shouldn't. That's what historically made cities wonderful, was the fact that every city was its own unique place and it had its own unique sort of stamp in time. The next is learning. People learn from old places, and they learn information that is not accessible to them in any other way. History can be understood at the real place where history actually happened in a way that can't be understood through documents and books alone. And this is so telling when you visit many historical sites. For example, you can go through Colonial Williamsburg, or I personally visited a concentration camp in Auschwitz. You feel and you understand history and learning differently when you're able to understand and experience a place. And that comes from preserving those places for future generations of people to learn from and enjoy. Sustainability. There's so many things that can be said about this, so I'll just quickly say that the greenest building is the one that is already built. There are many different aspects of sustainability here. We'll say avoided impact, which is that reusing buildings avoids environmental impacts of processing new materials and of putting old materials in landfills. Land conservation, and that you reuse what has already been taken over. You avoid infringing on forests, farms, wildlife, things like that. Embodied energy, which is the concept that a building is comprised of different materials and all of the labor and time that went into building that building, and it has an embodied energy to it. So if that were to be demolished or those materials were removed, you're extracting energy out of the building that somebody employed to put it there in the first place. Operating energy. Many old buildings, because of the way they're designed, already use less operating energy than new buildings. For example, on historic buildings, you typically see windows that were designed to create passive ways of cooling. You see deep porches to create shade. You see materials such as white concrete tile that were used to help reflect the heat of the sun. So historic buildings have a really beautiful way of being designed in such a way that they were inherently sustainable and inherently efficient. Passive design, I just talked about that a little bit, and then transportation and density, which is that older communities often had existing transportation corridors and were walkable, and were places where people could sort of live, work, and play all in the same setting. And I think, as many of you know, that's a growing trend today, that people are wanting to come back to cities and walkable communities. Ancestors. Old places connect us to our ancestors, and our ancestors connect us to old places, giving us a sense of belonging and identity. And searching for their family's past, the where is important to people, and being able to experience the where is often deeply moving. Old places that connect us to our ancestors provide an exceptional experience for people, an experience that is deeply beneficial. Community. Old communities are often the places where people share a common space, a common experience, and a shared sense of what the space means to them. People in a community share a sense of its identity and character, and it's often represented by the old places that serve as community landmarks. The experience of living, working, shopping, exercising, worshiping, and playing in and around these old places builds a sense of our shared community, and it is a sense of community that transcends generations. Economics. There's 6 key reasons that preservation and economics go hand in hand. I'll just read them off. Jobs, income, state and local taxes, heritage tourism, revitalization, attracting talent and investment, property values, business incubation, including small business retention. And I'm going to go ahead and move past this, but just know that there are so many studies that have been done on the effects, on the economic effects that historic preservation has on community. I think there are hundreds that have been done. And just to sort of wrap it all up, this slide I think just kind of brings us full circle. So are there things we should be doing better? Yes, definitely, as Mr. Waters described a few moments ago. Are there disagreements among people who work to save old places? Yes, and there have been historically, and there will always continue to be. And are there arguments about what we retain and how we retain it? Yes, again, there have been historically, and there always will be moving forward. And there should be. But the fundamental point remains that the history, memory, and continuity provided through old places are necessary for our self-worth and our good for people. So that concludes the little presentation on why old places matter.
So I want to jump in with you now,